Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Zweibelson. I'm a design facilitator and educator with the Joint Special Operations University here at SOCOM.
And I'm Nate Schwagler, on faculty here at the Joint Special Operations University, teaching creative thinking and design.
So we're going to continue our series on facilitation and military design, talking about one of our other unique design techniques that we use here in the classroom. And if you can check out some of our other videos on Think JSOU, we show the JAWS shark exercise. That's the first event that any military design student gets on their first day. We also are going to be showing other techniques, such as what we call the paper roll and several others. And what is important about all these, and Nate will add on more to this, is that we're all about the hands-on learning as you do. You've got to be able to experience design to really understand it. But at the same time, it's not about gimmicks. The gimmick itself is just to excite the people, because once they realize the lessons that are going on, that's when we reveal why this is so important and why it matters.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really great point, Ben, in that there's a really big difference between learning the words for design versus actually having to experience design and then unpack it through a facilitated debrief to then kind of unearth those lessons and connect what I just felt or experienced in that exercise to my day-to-day job requirements or my personal life, professional life, etc. Like it's about making it's the connective tissue. Right? So that's really the work that we get to do. And the reason that I'm particularly excited about this segment of the facilitation series is that we're going to go through an exercise that comes from my personal life. So this is fun because this is a challenge that was sort of stumbled upon, or probably an emergent property of parenting, but developed by my then 3-year-old son and I back maybe 10 years ago. And we call this one the puzzle exercise.
So on facilitation with design, the one last thing we'll leave you with in this intro is that if you're having a delicious design meal, it can be a fancy restaurant or it can be a nice local restaurant. But if you are eating something that's really quality, that's creative, that's well put together, you know as you're eating it, wow, this cook or this chef or whoever it is, they nailed it, they killed it, versus the experience of going and getting something that's fast food. Fast food still is enjoyable, but there's a huge difference between them. And so when design is just thrown together with gimmicks, you end up with what I call junk food design. So what we provide here at JSOU is we really focus on, even if it's not an expensive meal, it's going to be a delicious, wholesome design meal. So this video is for design facilitators. So we are going to show you a design schedule, which has all of the tasks, a proposed timeline, and how you want to set this up and actually execute it so that you can facilitate this with a group. We've done as large as classes of 30 to 40 students, although we recommend you try to keep it around 25 or less. Normally we have our design teams already divided up into 4, sometimes 5 design teams. And then these groups will get this challenge in between the design education that we're providing during our course. This exercise can be done independently, but we use it at JSOU to break up the stress and the challenges of working on a real-world design scenario to then kind of get the blood flowing and get everyone excited. And this definitely does get people excited, and we'll get into the effects there. You'll need to have a series of puzzles, and these are very specific puzzles. I'll pass over to Nate and he can tell you why, but you want to have 5 or 10 of them, 1 puzzle per team, and they have to be prepped with numbers underneath and then set up in boxes and staged. And then lastly, there has to be a somewhat, not necessarily misleading, because the students will make assumptions, but there's going to be a cover sheet that we provide them with the instructions. And the instructions involve having the students do a plan of action, assembling this puzzle. They're given some time to come up with their plan, construct it, before we give them the puzzle and before we start the time. And this also ties into military students are generally very competitive, and as soon as they know it's a contest on who can put the puzzle together first, you'll see that it adds to that effect, and we'll talk more about the outputs.
All right, so now we're going to talk about how to facilitate the puzzle exercise. So to kick things off, you're going to need a series of puzzles. So you're going to have to buy these ahead of time. We recommend a couple weeks in advance so that you have time to ship, but then also importantly, time to prep.
Yeah.
because you're going to have to open all these puzzles and write numbers on the back of each puzzle piece in numerical order 1 through X, right? We originally started out using this puzzle, Thomas the Tank Engine, and I bought 10 of these things or 12 of these at Target one day, maybe 10 years ago. And it's a 48-piece puzzle, but it has some unique qualities to it in that it's not a rectangle. And Ben will talk more about that and why that's important. Additionally, it's larger than people think it's going to be, and that also plays into some of the experience that shows up in the end. But we've since moved on from the Thomas the Tank Engine puzzles because they don't make them anymore, and we found some surrogate puzzles in the shape of a dragon instead. But it doesn't really matter what's on the surface or the cover of the puzzles, the image of it. More importantly, it needs to be non-rectangular. 48 to 50 or 55 pieces is approximately the sweet spot in terms of the numbers of pieces that you're looking for. And then we recommend finding a children's puzzle or something that's oversized relative to kind of the smaller puzzle pieces that maybe you worked on when you've previously worked on puzzles. So importantly, you're going to have to flip over every one of these puzzles. And we recommend assembling them first and then going in numerical order in a pattern around the puzzle so that each number connects to the next one. So puzzle piece number 1 connects to 2 and connects to 3, everywhere there's a joint. So what you're actually doing is you're writing a roadmap for assembly on the back of the puzzle pieces in a black Sharpie marker. Next, once you've got your puzzles completed, you're going to put them in a bag, and then you can either cut the box top off of the physical puzzle, or you can get a photocopy of it for future use or ease of transportation or something like that. But this is important because you're going to place the puzzles underneath the working groups or your design teams underneath their tables ahead of time, or you can kind of have them off to the side. But importantly, you can't let groups ever see the numbers on the bottom, and we'll tell you more about that in a minute. So the way the exercise moves, once you've got the staging set up correctly, is we like to play a fun game here, and we ask everybody in the room to raise their dominant hand and point it to the ceiling. And people kind of look around like, what's this all about? But they do it, and we say, okay, now when I say go, everybody point to the most responsible person at their table. Go. Right? And people kind of like look around and laugh, and if they know each other, it's funny, and if they don't know each other, that's funny too. It's just a good way to get started. But what you're actually doing here is you say, okay, great. Now, if you have a most responsible person, that person is now the team leader. Mm-hmm. If you have nobody who's responsible at the table, that's a separate course, and we'll have to talk about that later. But at the end of the day, you need one person who agrees to be the team lead. And then you invite those team leads to come and see you, the facilitator. And you say, okay, team leads, now you hand them that box top cover, or you hand them the photocopy of the box top, and you say, you have a task, a planning task, and use the word planning, and Ben will talk about why. You have a planning task ahead of you. We want you and your team to come up with a plan for how you could assemble this puzzle in the least amount of time possible. And we say you're going to have 2 minutes to come up with a plan. And you don't really want to take any questions at this point. You want to kind of leave it at that higher level. But hand out the covers so everybody has them, and say, okay, team leads, go run your planning session. So they're going to go back to their design teams, and they know they're on the clock. So the clock is ticking, and they're coming up with, okay, you're going to do the colors, or you're going to do the edges, or you're going to do this, right? Every team starts to distribute or divide labor, right? So once that 2 minutes is up, you want to either go get your puzzles if they're off to the side, or if they're already staged underneath the tables, that's even better. But you want to cue up a soundtrack. And you can use YouTube and pull up the track, and there's a very specific track, and we'll link to it in our worksheet so you have access to the same music that we use.
It's right here.
But importantly, it's got a sort of an anxiety-inducing quality to it, in that it starts off quiet, like a background of a cafe scene, and then it picks up in tempo and picks up in volume, and there's clinging and clanging of dishes and silverware and things. And you almost don't even notice that it's happening, but it's got this physiological effect on participants, and it adds a really interesting kind of stressful quality to the exercise. But once their 2 minutes of planning time is up, you say, okay, ladies and gentlemen, either A, your puzzles are under your table and your time begins now, or B, you have your co-facilitators drop the puzzles on the table, one puzzle per team, and you say go. And at the same time, you hit play on that music. And that gets you through all the planning up until they've said go.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So just to add on the planning part, being a military person or a retired military person myself, the first thing that we like to do is delegate responsibilities and roles. And so everyone says, well, we know, and there's a lot of assumptions that are made here. Most of the time, they're going to say, oh, it's going to be a rectangular puzzle, and this is what it looks like. And they literally take the image that you show them as that's the puzzle with square edges. And so then they start saying, you two are in charge of the corners. You're in charge of anything with one line. I'll do the middle, you do this, you do that. And so they figure out, and not all the teams do this, but most of them do. They delegate, and there's somebody that's just kind of there cracking the whip, making it happen, and then the puzzle drops. And then suddenly, the challenge becomes, do we stick with our plan, or do we improvise? And
key piece here. Ben brings up a really key piece. There's a mental process that's happening when you're going through this planning process. One, the team lead thinks it's his or her responsibility to Ben's point, is to delegate the roles. But then once they get their puzzle pieces, some teams will have said they were smart enough to know, hey, maybe these puzzle pieces won't be all kind of right side up, so let's all flip them over ahead of time. Other teams are just going to go in and do the task that they were assigned, right? So a funny thing will happen in that some teams will never notice that there are numbers on the back of these puzzle pieces at all.
Yeah.
They'll go through and build the whole thing without ever seeing this fascinating new information, this data that's now available, because they simply weren't expecting it. They weren't looking for it, right?
We had a few students say, oh, I saw that and thought it was just an inventory. It was just how you guys keep track of the puzzle pieces.
Yeah.
Remember that one? Yeah.
And then other teams someone will notice the numbers on the back of the puzzle pieces, but what do you do with that, right? Mm-hmm. They know it's an anomalous feature. It's not like these are perfectly printed. These are handwritten on the back of the puzzle pieces, right? Additionally, you then have to stop and think to yourself, like, what do I do with this data? Do I raise it as a concern to my team, or do I sort of look at another piece to see if there's a number on it? Do I try to put two of them together, right? Just to test it, right? A few key behaviors that we see regularly, and it's worth noting that I've been running this exercise for over a decade, hundreds of teams, probably thousands actually, across different industries, across all different demographic splits that you can imagine. And we see the same phenomenon and the same behaviors show up over and over and over again as they're trying to build this puzzle. And most teams, most of the time, flip the pieces over and they begin to assemble. Approximately 50% of the teams proceed as if they've never seen the numbers in the first place. They're sort of willfully ignorant, or they don't want to deviate from the plan, what they agreed to do ahead of time. And they're very comfortable and familiar with puzzle assembly. They likely put puzzles together as children, and they're bringing that same approach to this current exercise. No deviation necessary. The other half of the teams, somebody on that team will realize that there are numbers on the back of the puzzle pieces, but that puts them in an interesting position in that they then have to figure out, what do I do with this new information? And most of the time we'll find people who, once they notice the information, will start to probe it for value, right? Like, why is this here? What can this give me? What does this do for me? So they'll start experimenting and seeing is there a logic structure to this new information, or is it misinformation? Is this a red herring? Are these just random numbers, right? But after a quick prototype or experimentation, you realize very quickly that the numbers aren't random, but instead it's a roadmap for how you can assemble this puzzle without seeing the picture up. So at that point, it becomes critical that once you've demonstrated the value of the numbers up approach, you then have to convince the team to move off of the plan of what they said they were going to do, whether you're that team lead or if you're in a position where you don't necessarily have the same leadership role or the authority, perhaps, right? You have to then convince the rest of the team that this is a worthy endeavor, right? Mm-hmm. And it can be a tricky thing to do because there are 4 or 5 other teams in that room who are all trying to win, right? We find that to be a particular, with the SOF community, nobody wants to come in second place, right? So whether you've gone picture up or numbers up, most teams are usually in approximately the same position in terms of percentage of completion. By the time they hit the 3.5, 4 minute mark, they're just starting to finish. And a really fascinating thing happens. This is actually my favorite point, and what I'll encourage you and your co-facilitators when you're trying this exercise out is you have to be really mindful. You have to be actively listening to the conversations that are happening at the tables, because somebody's going to say, oh crap, how do we flip it over? And what follows this question is a beautiful tracking opportunity of creativity and imagination, because the way that a person frames that question, or the way that they challenge the group to think about that, will determine how they finish with this challenge. The first path, if they frame the challenge as how do we flip it over, they're going to scan the room and look for different tools and techniques and different ways that you could do it, right? We've seen everything from flip chart paper getting slid underneath it, to a table being pinched over the top of another table to pancake the thing, the one arm underneath and flip it over row by row, which just falls apart to, 48 different pieces. But you can get clever or creative in terms of the way that you try to flip the puzzle pieces over, right? The alternative path is for somebody, there's this little window, and somebody can challenge the core assumption here, which is that the puzzle needs to be face up in order to be complete. So you can challenge what success looks like, right? You can challenge the end state and say, well, wait a minute. The original prompt was to assemble the puzzle in the least amount of time possible. It didn't say anything about whether the picture had to be face up or not, right? So there's this beautiful moment, which becomes a key debrief point to unpack once you hit that, once you move into the next phase of the exercise. Ben, from your perspective, you've run this exercise around the world with a variety of different military organizations. What's the so what here? Are we just playing with puzzles, or why is this? What does this mean?
So I think this is a great example of when we're talking about design thinking, and we talk about complexity, and not just designers. Everybody talks about complexity. But when you have, say, a complex system, a hurricane, and it's offshore and it's coming in towards Florida, that in itself, if there were no people on the planet, if humans didn't exist, that would be a complex system. But second order complexity is when human beings get involved in trying to understand complex systems and how they are part of it. And this is where we use language, narratives, metaphors, beliefs, values, theories, hypotheses. All these things are tangled up where we're trying to make sense of what we're doing in a complex environment. So when you give a military team a puzzle challenge while they're racing against everyone else, and you've given them a plan, everything is set up for them to then go into the lesson of talking about thinking about your thinking. And the second order complexity is, why is it that most of you, and we can say this because it generally happens most of the time, as Nate said, why is it that most of you struggle with changing your plan, right? So that's one of the first elements you can discuss. The second one is what Nate also mentioned, is there's always a minority voice who says, there's numbers on the bottom, right? And sometimes that person will be told, keep doing your job, shut up.
Shut up and color.
Shut up and color.
We have a plan, stick to it,
Stick
right?
to the plan. We don't have time for that. We don't need it. But then suddenly, for some groups, they'll say, no, we can use the numbers. It's faster. And then suddenly the plan starts to change. But even then, you'll see some teams will still struggle, especially with that last assumption that all puzzles are completed face up.
Yeah.
Right? And so when we start talking about thinking about second order complexity of you as the human being, or you in the organization involved in trying to make sense of a complex reality and act within it. And when we start thinking about our words, our structures, all these things, the puzzle exercise is a beautiful way of painting this for all the students to experience it. And so then when we provide those lessons afterwards, remember in the puzzle game, we can go right back to that. And that's why I really enjoy this as a great action learning technique.
So undoubtedly, some team is going to go, they're going to finish first, and they're going to say, done, right? And you and your co-facilitators can come by, check out their puzzle, and people around the room are going to look and go, oh, that's BS because they didn't put it, they didn't have it's not facing the right way. Tuck all those in your back pocket, all those comments, because that's rich material for your after action and your debrief, right? But importantly, encourage all teams to finish. Just because one team finishes first, let the other ones, give them time too. And as a quick facilitator note, you can use that time, if you're allowed to have cameras in the room, It's a nice kind of team exercise takeaway. Have them hold up the picture of the box top cover in front of their puzzle and get a quick team shot. And that fills that time. You can move around the room and get a picture of everybody while each team is finishing. At the conclusion, once everyone's done, you're going to cut your music and invite the groups to return back to their seats so you can conduct the debrief. And it's during this debrief is where all the magic happens. It's where all the good stuff occurs here. So in terms of landing the learning of the exercise, the first question I like to ask is, tell me about the process you went through before. People are going to want to jump in right away and start talking about numbers up, picture up, and kind of what happened. We say, hold on a second. Tell me what you said you were going to do. What had you agreed to do in the 2 minutes of planning time that you had? And this is a key point, because as much as we like to think we were, unique snowflakes and really clever, right? You realize that every team all had the exact same plan coming through. So with the 2 minutes that they have for planning, every team agrees to do the same tasks, right? They break it up into 4 chunks. Mm-hmm. First, every team says, okay, we're gonna have to flip the puzzle pieces over. 2, we're gonna find the edges first. So they, divide the labor for some people to build from the edges in, right? Get the edges of the corners done. Third thing is they start breaking them up by color and say, okay, you find the reds, you find the blues, you do the grays. And then the last thing we'll do is there are some unique visual qualities to the pieces in the sense that, like, hey, there's a face there, you get the face, you do the train tracks, you do the wheels, you do the dragon's nose, etc., right? So every team, independent of their job, their background, the branch of service, wherever they're coming from, it doesn't matter. They all think that puzzles have a formula for how you do this. There's a doctrine to puzzle assembly, and every team, during this debrief, they all confess it to you, which is key, because then you say, okay, we gave you the puzzles, and then what happened? And teams will jump in and start talking about, well, we realized there were numbers on the back, and there's a natural follow-up question you have right there, and the tip of your tongue is to say, okay, who saw the numbers? What was that like for you? How did you call time out and challenge your group to then consider deviating from your plan? Right? Like, how did that unfold for your team in the moment? So there's some richness and some good stories to pull out there. What else do you notice when you're running this exercise?
So I love working in a lot of the core lessons that we talk about and we apply to real military challenges, because in our courses, the designers are actually working on some, real world military challenge that they got to work with, applying the design tools. So emergence is one of those things that we talk about all the time. Emergence. All right. So a lot of times people start with, well, give me an example of emergence. And one example here of a weaker type of emergence is the dependence on a plan when they haven't seen the puzzle yet is sort of like doing mission analysis and COA wargaming before you've gone out the door. And that's just a part of how militaries look at military decision making. But when they're actually on the battlefield, so to speak, and they are moving and engaging and operating, this is where the original plan doesn't really work, and this is where improvisation, experimentation, sense-making, critical thinking, all these things come in within an emergent context. And that emergence is occurring because the first thing is the puzzle doesn't look like what we thought it would. Mm-hmm. And we now are faced with a changing environment or a changing context where we are now with the information we have, the numbers, as soon as the numbers are realized, the system is changed for those people. And that's where emergence now cannot be defined by the legacy system. And the legacy system for these students before they see the numbers is that puzzle pieces need to be face up. Mm-hmm. And as soon as they realize, nope, it's emergence. Now there's numbers. Nope, it's not square. There's a weird curvy shape, so that whole plan's out the window. And so this really becomes, how comfortable are they with letting go of the logical, analytical, structured, linear plan that made them feel good initially, and now move into sense-making, improvisation, thinking about your thinking, experimenting with, wait a minute, what if we totally change this? What if we do something completely different? And there's always that one team that did something so far out of the box we kind of said they cheated. But you know what I'm talking about? The stack?
Oh, so we have seen some really radical solutions to this puzzle. Ben's referring to one where we saw a team stack all the pieces on top of each other into a tower formation. And then they said, hey, we're done. And, if the prompt was assembly and we're agreeing that aesthetics or the subjective evaluation of quality is not relevant here, then I have to concur that they in fact did assemble the puzzle in the least amount of time possible. It just didn't look like what we're used to seeing.
It reminds me of that meme where the math teacher says find X on the triangle and the kid points and goes, it's here.
You know, there's another funny thing that I forgot to mention earlier, is that we've seen some really interesting behavior too in that, and it goes directly to what you were saying about getting into the planning process. You know, you get to a point where you're doing co-development and wargaming, and the same is true in the sense that when you're planning for this puzzle exercise, you're seeing yourself completing these actions, but you don't yet realize that the operating environment will have changed on you, right? Yeah. And it's funny because there are groups who never think there's actually a physical puzzle. Like when we've given them a photocopy of the box top, they think it's just a planning exercise. They're more interested in doing the planning than they are in thinking about how they're going to have to execute.
I remember that.
And the reason this is important is because think of the physical space. You know, for depending on the setup that you're running this exercise in, they've got coffee cups, workbooks, pens, pencils, Legos, dodgeballs, whatever workshop materials we've given them up until this point in the course, kind of spread around the table. And it's like, this is, like we said, an oversized puzzle. It's like 2.5 feet by 3 feet, right? So there's a large physical space requirement. And as soon as we throw the bags of puzzles on their table, or we tell them that your real physical puzzle is underneath the table, they then have to manufacture space for themselves to then execute the puzzle challenge, right? And I'll never forget this because we were in Germany.
I know the story.
We saw a guy who's, you know, is skilled in martial arts and sort of, you know, quick twitch thinking, you know, physical responsiveness. And his natural inclination was he just took his right hand and swept it across the table. Didn't matter what was on it. He wanted to win so badly that they created an enormous mess. And the reason this is particularly funny is because it was a woman sitting next to him who said, "Joe, there's an empty table right there." His brain didn't give him a chance to think about where else we might assemble this puzzle. But you will see some teams move the puzzle. If there's too much stuff on their table, they will move to the floor and start working. Just be mindful of any physical limitations that your participants might have, or if you have any participants in a wheelchair, et cetera, like you want to make sure there's an inclusive opportunity for them to participate and assemble as well. So just be mindful of that and make sure you've got, some teams are going to work on the floor, make sure that it's a clean floor because you need these puzzles to be clean for the next group.
So the big takeaway on this is, you know, why as a design facilitator do you even need to know this? You can do any type of technique that you want, but like we said earlier, if you are just about games and techniques and it's just not holding anything together, it starts tilting towards really simple, or what I call junk food design. And that just doesn't have the substance that our militaries need to really change their organizations, foster lasting innovation and creativity, and change themselves from reactive organizations to learning organizations. And so there has to be a so what to why do we do the puzzle game. And the puzzle game for facilitators provides a great backdrop to introducing deeper concepts on complexity, second order complexity, emergence, the inability to break away from a linear plan, the inability to critically and reflectively think in action or sense make as it's used in social sciences. And lastly, the element of hands-on and teamwork is essential. And you'll notice that most of our design facilitation techniques that we provide here involve this. It's teams doing something, and the something that they're doing, it doesn't really look military at all, which is important because it takes them away from comfort zones, but it also disarms them a bit. And I found that if we use a really military-themed technique or a military thing, sometimes people just can't let go. They can't let go to the things they really, really know. I know this is reality. But if you make them play with paper or Lego or Jaws movies, they're okay. They're willing to experiment and even critically think, well, I did do that, didn't I? I yelled at you to keep making the puzzle. Oh, man. Do I do that all the time?
Yeah, to your list of deeper concepts that I think show up in this exercise, I'd add heuristic decision-making, right? Mm-hmm. Metacognition, and assumption reversal, right? Being able to challenge what success looks like. Are we relying on what success, how it was defined in a legacy system, or are we willing to invite that emergence into our process and then have an evolving definition of success, right? Can we lean forward into that uncertain space, which is critical, I think, if you're going to do design well. One last important facilitator note. It's very possible that the teams who come in first place when you run this session will be a team that did it the traditional way, right? Image up. If that's the case, some teams may say, well, wait a minute, why do we need to be doing all this experimental designy stuff? We did it the old-fashioned way and we won, right? Now, this is critical. This is a very important, because you don't want to lose the room, and it's possible here if you don't have a strong response. And that you can invite or follow back up with a question. And you say, congratulations, you and your team did assemble this puzzle in the least amount of time possible. The question then becomes, if you got to do it again, knowing what you know now, which strategy would you employ? Which path would you take your team down? Because it's approximately a 50-50 split. Like I said, we've done this with thousands of teams. It's approximately 50-50 in terms of how the strategy used and who comes out first. But if you do it a second time with process awareness or knowledge of the numbers on the back, numbers wins every single time. So there's an organizational learning debrief point here that I think is really, really important. Do you want to build on that?
So that also ties into going back into complexity theory. It's hard for students to sometimes understand that a complex system is going to have very sensitive initial conditions. And what that really means is that each time you start the system, a small little change can cause catastrophic differences. And they do this in like the Back to the Future movies, where he goes back to 1955 and then he comes back and everything's completely changed. But that is, in theory, what they're talking about is that if complex systems are that sensitive, then you don't get to repeat the puzzle exercise, because of course you do better the second time. Now you know what's going on. But the thing is, in complex systems that are dynamic, you'll never gain that new knowledge that suddenly allows you to have more control, because the system itself is learning and changing. Now you may gain information. That's not under debate. The question is that as you gain that information, the interaction with a complex system means that the system itself is also changing, which means you are perpetually changing as well, and you have to continue to do this design process. So for the students to understand that, say, look, you only got to do the puzzle exercise one time. There's no such thing as a simulation in terms of reality. You can only simulate an approximation of reality. And so here, what we can tell them is go and do the puzzle exercise with another group of new people from your organization and see what they do. You become the facilitator. And that's really the benefit, is that they can continue to see, how does their organization think? How do they make decisions? How do they plan? Doing this with a SIG or a CAG or a planning team or a planning section, it's fantastic, and it's fun too. Good teamwork.
Question for you. Do organizations need people who will try to put puzzles together, numbers up?
So it's really a question between, at an abstract level, convergent thinking and divergent thinking. You don't do one or the other, and people don't just do design all the time. They also do planning, and there's a combination in there. Some people are more proficient at convergent thinking, convergent processes, and some people are better at the divergent, the dreamers, the pontificators, the daydreamers, if you will, the creatives. And so as a leader in an organization, you have to manage your people and cultivate and see where these people are going to do the best job. It's always going to require diversity of ideas. And so you don't want a planning cell to have nothing but convergent planners, nor would you want a design team to be nothing but, pontificating artsy types. They'll never get anything done. So you have to have a nice combination. And that's why in most design methodologies, you see an activity of convergence, divergence, divergence, convergence. I mean, the British double diamond method actually founds its methodology entirely on that, quite literally. But almost every design activity is going to have some convergent and divergent process. And the puzzle exercise is nice because it highlights the convergences immediately when you give them that 2 minutes to plan. There's no divergent thinking. Everyone is about task, order, condition, execute, end state. And then as soon as someone looks at the puzzle piece, now it's suddenly divergence, emergence, all these great things that we want them to think about. So in conclusion, any last thoughts, and we'll wrap this up?
Yeah, one more facilitator note. We talked about why and when perhaps a facilitator might want to pull this one out of their kit bag. And I think there's another quality to this exercise that we haven't discussed yet, and that's from, it's the energy management perspective. Facilitators, a lot of your job, yeah, you're there to ask really good questions and sort of make sure teams have what they need, orientation to the challenge, the right tools, et cetera, at their tables to do good thinking. But I think a lot of what design facilitators have to do is manage energy in the room. And this exercise can be a great way to, if you see or you feel the flatness kind of set in, or a bunch of teams get stuck on something.
After lunch.
Yeah, exactly. You call timeout and you bring in the puzzle games, because I can tell you one thing. At the conclusion of this exercise, they're going to be back up to an 8 out of 10, right, at least. Some teams will be really buzzing about this, and the ones that aren't will be real reflective and sort of thinking about, well, why did we just get our asses handed to us on this thing? You know what I mean? Why, I'm a colonel. Why did we get beat by this team of junior folks? You know what I mean? It's a neat energy management tool.
Awesome. So on that, thanks for watching. This is in our facilitator series for the JSOU Design program. And what we invite you to do is check out the rest of Think JSOU, where we have lectures, we have podcasts, panels, we have more facilitation videos available, as well as Legends of Design, where we go around the world and find the best military and civilian or commercial design theorists and practitioners, and we get exclusive interviews and have them talk about their experiences, their new ideas, trying to get this information out for our students, our faculty, as well as the broader community of practice. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.